We can define it in various ways. So when you define it, you use the definition of various authors, and also can use the latest ones if you want. We have different types of population. We have a population which we call the target. Target is the entire population, all right? That's a target, all right? Then we have the accessible population. The difference between the two is that as a researcher, most of the time, you are not working with the target population. You are working with the accessible population. An example which I've given now, if I'm doing my research in primary schools in South Africa. Let's say my research, I'm saying the population is all the primary schools in South Africa. How many are they? There are too many, especially we have 9 provinces in South Africa. So there are many primary schools. Will I be able to reach them? Definitely I won't be able to reach them. Even though I could say I'm doing my research with primary schools in Gauteng province, there are too many. I can't even reach them. So what I'll do, instead of working with the target population, I'll work with the accessible population. The accessible population is the one which I can reach as a researcher, all right? And if I reach that population, I could also go further and generalize, because I feel that that accessible population, it represents part of the entire population, which is your target population. Then from there, I'll say, instead of going and work with all the primary schools in Gauteng, then I'll say, let me work all the primary schools in Ekurhuleni, for example, all right? In other words, I can choose a district to say, I'm working with only Ekurhuleni district. So I make myself accessible in regards to my research, and then there's a high possibility that I can reach that population of Ekurhuleni municipality. All right. I think I've just spoken in general about the 2 types of population, but let's look at what the researcher says about them, all right, or the authors says about this type of population. The target population is the entire group of people or objects to which the researcher wishes to generalize the study findings. I was just giving an example there. The accessible population, the portion of the population to which the researcher has reasonable access. The key word there, you as a researcher, you have a reasonable access. You can access that type of population, the accessible population. In other words, you won't struggle to have an access or to reach that type of population. It may be a subset of a target population. Basically, what they're saying there, in other words, when you look at the target population, like we've made an example, right? Let's work about, let's say our target population is all the primary schools in South Africa. All right, how many are they? Let's say maybe, for example, the 20,000. I'm just making an example. Now, in order for me to reach a reasonable amount of population, I can use what you call accessible population, whereby I take part, a subset of that entire population or the target population. All right. In other words, I will say, based in South Africa, I'll focus only on a certain part of the population in that specified area of South Africa in regards to primary schools. Then I'll only focus maybe in Gauteng province. All right. So we are talking about a subset here. All right. I think all of us, we have heard about the word subset. But how do you write this thing in our document? All right. Sometimes we don't even specify whether it is a target population or accessible population. Most of the time when you write it in our documents, whether it's a research proposal or a research report, we just say population, all right? But at the same time, when you write it up there, you indicate that the population, it consists of so many people, and also from this district or from this area or from this province, so that the reader could understand that even though we know that in South Africa we have so many primary schools, but you have tried to narrow down your population as per your accessibility, all right? Most of the time we don't use the word accessible population, we just write population, all right? These are some of the terminologies which we need to familiarize ourselves when we talk about sample, all right? Remember that we have a population, and from the population, let's say, for example, it's an access population, you can take a subset of that, part of that, all right? So now the part of that, definitely we call it sample, all right? So, but when you look at sample, where does sampling starts from? Right? Where do you start sample from? All right, you sample first from the population. You take the population. That's why there I have number one as population. All right. So the terminology which you need to know, be familiar about when you talk about sampling is population. That's why we have described what population is. All right. So, well, simple definition is that population is a total set of units. We spoke about that one. And also we need to understand the sample. What is a sample? Right? Various authors describe sample, but simply, I like this presentation, and I think it's one of our colleagues who was presenting a week ago. All right, she presented this type of a presentation when she was talking about the research proposal. So I found it more interesting, especially when I talk about the area of population and sampling, where you try to explain the concept in the simplest way. All right, look at sample. It's a subset of the population. In other words, a sample is part of the population, a little bit of the population. All right. In other words, you don't take the whole number of participants. You just take a part of the participant. And remember that, colleagues, I will repeat it until I complete this presentation. In qualitative, all right, most of the time, like I've said, we are more concerned about the perception. All right, and there's no one will query you are writing up in qualitative study to say, why have you interviewed 7 people? You can interview 7 participants and be able to write a rich PhD document around that, because the purpose there is just to get the perception and the understanding of the participant, so that you come with your themes and you explain the different themes which you came about. That's all we need to do in regards to qualitative, like we spoke in last week. But as sample is a subset of the population, we need also to understand the terminology which we call it sampling frame. All right. In other words, sampling frame, we are referring to the list from which to select your sample. Remember that. 1, you have population. From the population, you take part of your population. We call it sample. Then from there, you need to talk about a sample frame. I'll make it in this way, the simplest way, maybe you'll understand it. 1, let's say my population, I'm working with 30 primary, let's say 30 teachers, all right? There are 30 teachers, all right? From one school, all right? And if I have 30 teachers, that is my population. Now I say I'm going to take a sample of this population. I'll take some of these teachers, all right? Then let's say, for example, I say to myself, all right, I'm working with these teachers, they are 30. Let me look at the school structure. The school structure, most of the time, especially if I look at primary schools, all right? Let's say it's primary schools. It's basically divided into, I think, into 3, all right? Which you call them foundation, or which you call them phases. Sorry, there are phases, all right? Then I'll make sure that I have a sample frame. My sample frame, I'll ensure that I'll consider the phases. All right, then I'll have 3 phases. That will be the list from which to select my sample. All right, then I'll say definitely I'll have a sample frame which is based on the phases. Then I'll say in the foundation phase, the intermediate phase, and the senior phase. Then I'll say, because I'm working at with 30 teachers here, maybe let's say I'll take 10 teachers from the foundation phase, 10 teachers from the intermediate phase, and 10 teachers from the senior phase. All right. Now what I've done is 10 teachers from the foundation phase, 10 from the intermediate phase, and 10 from the senior phase. This I'll call a sample. All right. In other words, my sample, it consists of 10 teachers per phase. That's my sample. But what sample frame did I use? I've used a sample frame, which I call it, in this case, phases. All right. But when you look at the actual research, even though I can call these phases as my sample frame, then I'll go further to number 4 and say, look, the correct word which I was supposed to use, we call it the sample design. All right. Now I'll say, how did I sample my participant? What design did I use? One, we always talk about 2 main designs in research. The first one, we call it probability, right? Sampling is a design. The other one, we call it a non-probability sampling. We'll talk about those 2 types of sampling in our next slides. But basically, I'll say, in my case, I need to describe the design I've used, the sample design. I could say, maybe in my case, I've used a stratified sampling technique, all right? Maybe I've used a stratified. I'll say I've used a stratified sampling techniques. What does it mean? It means I've made sure that each participant in this primary school, all the teachers are represented equally. Then it's a strata, all right? Then I think the other point which I need to talk about here under number 3 then, in regards to the sampling frame, it says it's a unit from which I will be selecting my sample, complete list of everyone or everything you want to study. In other words, my example says 30 teachers, and I must make sure that I reach all the 30 teachers. Therefore, that's why I have to decide to use a certain sampling design. All right. Then also what I need to understand about the sampling, I need to understand the parameters. Colleagues, parameters. In my example, what is a parameter then? In other words, actually, what is it? How can I describe this population? All right. What characteristics do I get from this population? The characteristics I get from this population in my example is that there must be teachers. All right. Because my study is about teachers. Remember that if, for example, I say I'm going to research in a certain in this primary school, and I'm going to focus on the teachers. Then I go out, then I collect data from the members of the SGB. Let's say, for example, parents. Definitely, I'm out of my parameters now. All right, because I've said teachers. If I decide to say I become excited because I got a friend in mining, then I said, no, I'm getting a challenge to reach these 13 primary teachers in this school. Let me just go and dish out my questionnaire to the chief executive officer of a certain mine so that he must distribute it to the miners there. In other words, now my research won't work because I've went throughout my parameters. So the other thing which you need to understand, you need to understand the parameters, all right? And if you look at qualitative, all right, studies, especially when you do sampling and you're sampling, it's where it talks more. Because in qualitative, you need also to look at other things when you sample your participants. They must meet some of the criteria. They must be knowledgeable about the topic you're talking about. All right? That's one of the criteria. They must have a skill or interest, or they must have been involved in that type of industry so that you could be able to get more and more richer data from them. The other concept which also need to talk about, especially is equality statistics. That is the characteristics of sample. And when you talk about quantitative, it's where the weight statistics comes more because you talk about numbers, right? And what I've done here, colleagues, I've just projected what, especially in the section of your population, sample and sample techniques. All right. In other words, when you write it up, You tell us about the population. You tell us about the sample. You describe the sample design you have used or the sample frame you have used. You also indicate the parameters if possible, and also you give us the stats. All right. So that's how you write it up. I want us to quickly go and look again and start from sample, I think, and sampling techniques. I think we've spoken about this, even though I didn't put it in the form of a diagram, but that's what we spoke about. We said this is a total accessible or target population, all right? But you can take parts. And if you take part, it becomes a sample, all right? What is a sample? I think we tried to describe it then. In the slide there, it's a subset of the population, but other authors, they refer to it as follow. They say sampling is a process whereby a group of individuals are selected from the entire population with the intention of representing the larger group they have been selected from. Right? I think it's clear. But when you look at field, he described a sample as a smaller collection of units from a population used to determine truth about the population. In other words, the sample, it represents the population. That's why sometimes we say we use the way to generalize. We generalize based on the sample. In other words, what they mean if we say we generalize? We are saying that even though we can decide to collect data from this target population, let's say this 30 teachers from this primary school, you'll get the same results, even though you just take part of their population, which you call it a sample. We generalize, all right? To say these are the things which we expect, and they can happen even though you didn't have an accessibility to all the entire population. You can generalize your results around that. I think we now, the question is, which we always struggle with. We struggle with that question, and I'm happy that other authors, they also talk about the recommended sample size in regards to qualitative. They still have the recommended one there, all right? But I won't argue with those authors, because when I look at the numbers they are giving, especially the recommended sample size for qualitative, it's a huge number. Some of them, they're talking about 30, some of them. To say you must interview 30 people, it's a recommended. It's a lot, all right? Oh, but it's fine, it's what the authors, they argue there. But how much I'm supposed to sample? How much? And please, colleagues, one thing which is very important, if in your writing up, you are saying to me, I am going to sample different participants, all right? Let's say, for example, your research is based in this primary school. Then you say to me, you are going to sample teachers, you are going to sample SGP members, you are going to sample learners, all right? These are the three types of sample frame. It's not one. We have teachers, we have SGP, we have learners, all right? That's your teachers, SGP, and learners. So now when you design your instrument, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, you cannot use one instrument. It's what I've seen with my students most of the time. They'll say, I'm going to sample this group of participants, maybe 3, like I've just mentioned here, but they want to develop only one instrument. In other words, they want to, if it's quantitative, they want to give all these 3 types of groups or sample frame. You want to give them the same instrument, of which I disagree. You can't give a questionnaire, the same questionnaire, which you have given to the teachers, and give the learners the same questionnaire. It can't work like that. Because remember that in this, we are looking at the characteristics. And one of the things is knowledge and experience and skills. Imagine if I have a questionnaire which I've given to teachers in this school, and I take the same questionnaire, I give to learners. I don't think learners will be able to answer this questionnaire because there are things I'm going to ask them. Let's say, for example, I have a statement there which talks about curriculum development. Will my learners be able to answer that type of questionnaire? No, they are not. So I must design a separate instrument for them. The same thing with the SGP members. If SGP, I'm going to also sample them. I must develop a different instrument for them, which I'll put statements which are talking and are relevant to SGP, even though it's still under the same research title. All right, same with teachers. So it's one thing which I want to make you aware about, all right? So that you must know that in that way, you must have lots of, maybe 3 or 4 instruments. The same thing with if you are doing qualitative, right? I can't pose the same question in the interview, which I've posed to the SGP members and take it and ask my learners about them. No, it don't work. But basically, let's look at the sample size. Other authors, there are a lot of authors, all right? But this author says, it proposes they propose the following rules of thumb. Remember rules of thumb. What does it mean? It means it is not the rule, but in the instance that could happen, it's a rule of thumb. All right. It's not a blueprint. A rule which says, for example, there's a rule in the South African School Act which says learners are not supposed to be punished using corporal punishment. It's a rule. It's there. You can't go beyond that. All right. But if I talk about the rule of thumb, it means that it's not a blueprint rule to say when you do quantitative, you need to make sure that your sample size is 500. It's not a rule. Could be less than that. All right? But it should be more representative. Let's look at the sample size. They say the sample size larger than 30 and less than 500 are appropriate for most research. Right? In other words, if you have 8 and less than 500, talk about quantitative here, it's appropriate. And remember that when you justify, I always say to my students, when you justify your sample size, use literature. There are a lot of literature which you can also use to support your sample size. You cannot just say, I've decided, in my research, I've decided to sample 70 participants. Based on what? That's a question you'll be asking. Based on what? Then you need to say, in this research, 70 participants have been sampled. And this is supported by this author and that author to say a reasonable sample size, it should be like this in quantitative studies. So you're supporting your assertion with an author, all right? So you need also to look at some of those aspects. But think about if it's qualitative. Then I say, I'm going to sample 500 participants. I'm going to do individual interviews with 500 participants. I won't finish. And I'm telling you, by the time you reach your maybe participant 20 or 30, you're getting the same answer. So what you are going to do with the rest of the respondents from the other participants? Because you are now getting the same answer. We spoke about this last week, colleagues. All right, we know the point of saturation. It comes in, especially in qualitative. But this author also says where samples are to be taken into sub-samples. Remember, we spoke about sub-sample. All right. When I was making an example, said 30 primary teachers. Then I said, I'm going to apply a certain sampling technique, which I'll call it stratified. That's what you call a sub-sample. All right. In my case, I refer to it as stratified sample. It's part of the sample. right? So you can put it in the form of males or females, junior, senior, or seniors, and so on and so on. All right, you can just sample it the way you the sub sample. You can put it the way you want it. In my case, I've put it according to the phases which you get in the primary schools. All right, your foundation phase, intermediate phase, and senior phase. All right, but at the same time, we accept a minimum sample size of 30 for each category. In other words, if you have a sub sample, at least there should be 30 in each of the categories. In other words, your sub sample it should compose of 90, which is going to be 30, 30, 30 if there are three phases in my case. All right, but it's just a rule of thumb. Remember, it's just a rule of thumb. What's important about sub-sampling is that you need to give equal representation before you can generalize. That's what you are working for here. Equal representative of your sample before you can generalize. That's why I'm saying this rule of thumb. I don't think it's applicable, especially in qualitative studies or research. It's not applicable because if you are saying to me, I need to sample 400, like I've said, and I'm doing an interview, it means I must interview 400 people. It's a lot, right? We spoke about all of this even last week. There are stages in the selection of sample. How to select your sample? Colleagues, I want to say this to you honestly. When you write your research proposal, you must think about all of these things, right? You must think. Don't just write it for the sake of writing. Because if you're going to write this research proposal for the sake of putting all of these things to be fancy, you are going to be catch up somewhere. Remember that your research proposal, after you have submitted it, all right, even though it's that 400 weights, and they ask for the intensive one, then they grant you permission, an ethical permission to do your research. Once you start to write your research up, all right, and then you give us the research report, we are going to look at your research proposal. All right, that's why we say most of the time your chapter 1 of your research report, it is your research proposal. I always say to my students, take your chapter 1. When you write a research report now, your chapter 1, you take information the way it is from your research proposal. The only thing you can work around is just the tenses, all right? And remember that in your research proposal, most of the time, it's something which you are intending to do. So we always say and argue that maybe the tense should be in the future tense. All right. Now, when you write the research report, you are reporting on what you have done. It could be your tense could be in a form of present tense or in a past tense. That's why we say now, when you write the research report, please look at the tense, but the information is going to be the same. All right. So when you are progressing and you're looking at your writing up for your research report, now you're submitting it now. I'll always look at your chapter 1. Then I'll look, for example, if I want to talk about methodology, the research methodology, most of the time it's chapter 3 for masters or chapter 4 for PhDs. I go to chapter 1 and say to you, look, the chapter 1, you said the population is going to be like this. And you said you are going to apply stratified sampling techniques. But when I look at your research methodology, we are talking about something different now. All right? We are not even talking about sampling techniques, the stratified. We are talking about maybe convenience sampling technique. Why now? You need to justify. All right. I'm just bringing these things, colleagues, for you to be aware of them, is it? To say, when you have written your research proposal, please don't think that when you write your research report, you're going to go out of that. Stick on that. All right. But now we expand, remember, isn't it? Because now it's a report. All right. We expand. And you'll see when you speak about literature review, especially next week, how do I emphasize the writing up of the literature review? If, for example, in your research report, I'm just making an example of all of these things. If in your research report, we have cited this author, right? This is the author you've cited in your research report. To say chapter 1, when you talk about, let's say, for example, you explain the data collection, right? Or maybe you explain the methodology to say, the method I'll be using is quantitative. Then you briefly explain quantitative there in your chapter 1. Then you give a source of 1 or 2 authors there. Then you go again, let's say in your chapter 3 on the research methodology. You also have to put a section on the research method you've used. Let's say quantitative. You repeat the same authors you have put in chapter 1. It's not supposed to be like that. You bring new authors now. All right, that's what we do. The only part where you don't bring new authors in your research report, it's when you are going to interpret your data. You don't come with new authors there. You use the same authors we have used, for example, in your literature review and also in your chapter 1 and in your introduction for your chapter 1. All right, there's only part where you don't bring new authors there. Because once you start to get new authors, when you interpret your results, you just try to support your results with literature. Then I see new literature, I'm going to question that. And I'm telling you, you are going to correct that. And it's not good to correct some of this stuff. All right. So you must bear those things in mind going forward. All right. I want us to look at the stages in the selection of the sample. How do you select your sample? Remember that. I want to go back here. This. In your writing, whether it's your research proposal or your research report, always remember this. All of this, please. All right? When you write any section, all right, regarding to sampling techniques or sampling, think about all of this. Make sure that you check all of these are represented in that section. All right? Now we need to look at the steps. Where to start? Or stages, if you want to call them stages. All right? The stages in the selection of sample. Where do you start by selecting a sample? 1, you define the target population. We've spoken about that one. I think it's almost similar like the slide I've just shown. You select a sample frame. All right? I think this is almost a repetition of that. Maybe just I've put it in a different way here. Then from there, you determine the sample techniques. We've spoken about this. Then you plan the procedure, all right, for selecting your sample techniques. Then you determine the sample size. And from there, you select the actual sample unit. Then now you select. All these things need to be followed, colleagues. Please. And remember that you don't follow these stages without also reading about these aspects from literature or different authors. Different authors will explain to you guys, right? And I think I've spoken about this when I started with my presentation, with my workshops. The first one I've said, if you are not familiar with any concept when you develop your research proposal, go and read about it, right? Please read about it. Others, they use YouTube. It's fine. You can also go to YouTube, but I don't prefer YouTube. I prefer the peer review sources. What are the peer review sources? Could be books, could be your articles. Those are the ones which I like to use the most. All right, because they have been peer reviewed. You'll hear when we explain what peer review it's all about in some of our presentations. All right, but basically, let's quickly look at. Now I want to look at the qualitative researcher. Please, it's not qualitative method. It's a researcher who does qualitative studies. And we're also going to look at a researcher who does quantitative studies. Then you call that person a quantitative researcher. Colleagues, we don't have a researcher, which you call it a mixed researcher. Please make note of that. All right? You can't refer to a person to say this researcher is a mixed researcher. No, no. But we have a mixed research method where you use both quantitative and qualitative. So please note that point. Let's look at the first type of researcher. Let's look at the qualitative researcher. Always the qualitative researcher focus on the perceptions, and that's why they are always seeking to reach a point of saturation. In other words, the qualitative researchers are not concerned about numbers, but it doesn't mean that a number won't come up. It will come up under qualitative to say, I've interviewed 8 participants, and when I reach the 5th participant, it's when the point of saturation was reached. Right? So number will come there, but what's important is that the point of saturation. But when you look at the quantitative research, they are more and more concerned about numbers, statistics. All right? They seek statistical validity. They want to say you can't conduct a quantitative study and you tell me that you have issued out to the questionnaire to only 3 people or maybe 3 schools in Gauteng province. That is not valid. You can't generalize based on that. All right? Your number should be a reasonable number. But when you look again at qualitative research, the sample size do not count. All right? That's why sometimes when we write our research proposal, we are not able to put numbers if you are going to use qualitative methods. All right? You are not going to put numbers. But when you are using quantitative methods and you are writing a research proposal, the quantitative researcher will represent numbers and put numbers up front. All right? And what's important again with a qualitative researcher is that numbers are irrelevant. What's important is the understanding of the perceptions, is that we are able to get more perceptions from the participant. And remember when we spoke about data collection in qualitative research last week, we said the qualitative researcher is present. Remember that? We said this person is present in the setup. In other words, the qualitative researcher is there because this researcher needs to collect data in a different form of way, for example, interviews or group focus interviews and so on. So the person is available in the setup compared to the quantitative. The quantitative researcher could send out a questionnaire and email it if you want to do, or send it by post. Unfortunately, the post is no longer working nowadays, but you can send it and you're not even there. So if the participants are struggling with a certain statement in the questionnaire, they can't even ask you because you're not there. That's why we say you pilot before you distribute your data collection instrument to avoid your participant not to be able to answer some of the statement, because if they're not able to answer some of the statement and they're supposed to give answers to the questionnaire on the spot and no one's going to explain to them, then it creates a certain problem in your data. Then you are going to analyze it, you end up having many statements not being answered. Sometimes we call it spoiled responses and so on. All right. Let's quickly look at sample techniques in quantitative now. I want to focus more on the different methods now of studies. Quantitative, how do you sample? Remember that we're just referring to sampling in general, all right? But somewhere I've said this could not be applicable in qualitative, all right? But let's look at the different types of sample. Sampling techniques. Remember we spoke about those sampling techniques? Well, we said we have what you call probability samples and non-probability sample, right? And this type of sampling, they have subtypes, all right? In quantitative research, we use both probability samples and non-probability sample. And remember, colleagues, how do you pick up to say a student have used either probability sample or non-probability sample? We pick it up simple by the example of the sampling technique you've used, right? For example, we have what you call simple random sample. We have what you call stratified random sample. We also have, that's in quantitative, all right? We also have what you call cluster sampling. We also have systematic sampling. We also, I just want to look at some of these quickly. All right, then you also have the non-probability sample, which is more convenient sampling, and also quota sampling and snowballing sampling. Right. Let's quickly look at quantitative, colleagues. We can use simple random sampling. What is simple sampling, random sampling? It's whereby participants are selected in such a way that all members of the population could have an equal representation. All right, that is simple. For example, if you want to select a simple random sample of 100 learners from school A, how can you select that? How can you select these learners using simple random sample? You can start to assign a number to every learner in a school database. In other words, let's say the population of these school learners in school A is 1,000, but you want to select only 100. How you can do that? You give them numbers. All right, let's say from grade R, from grade 1, I don't like to start from grade R, but I know that grade R now form part of the foundation phase. But let's start from grade 1. The first learner, you can do it in alphabetical order as per grade, or as per grade from grade 1. Then you give the first learner, you give number 1 until you reach the last learner in your senior phase. Then you end up having 1,000 learners. All right, you give them numbers from 1 to 1,000, but you want to select a sample of 100. And you've assigned numbers through school database from 1 to 1,000. Then you can use through MS Word. I think through MS Word or even Excel. I think Excel and MS Word, you can use them. There is what you call the random number generator. Then you can use the random number generator to select these 100 learners, right? Then you can select them in that way. Or alternatively, you can say to yourself, I want to select 100 learners from this 1,000. You can use another method, which sometimes we use it. Think about the lotto. How does the lotto spin? You know, you have all these numbers. Then you put them in the form of a lotto. Then you only select 100. Then definitely it's going to select different numbers. Maybe sometimes it selects the first learner as you per database, then it goes to the 10th learner, to the 12th learner, and so on. Otherwise, you apply a Lotho methods around that. But stratified random sampling, which I like it the most, I don't know why. I feel it talks to me. It's just what I've explained. You remember when I was making use of an example of the 30 primary school teachers in this school, I can apply stratified. The population is grouped into groups, for example, 2 or more, like we have done there. We've grouped this population of the teachers in this selected primary school. We've grouped them into 3 phases, all right? I don't think I'll go through this example because already I've explained it in one of the examples when I was trying to talk about stratified sample. Then you can also read this example. Excuse me. Then let's go to cluster sampling. Please don't confuse stratified sampling and also with the cluster, right? Those are two different, right? In a cluster sampling, a technique in which clusters of participants that represent the population are identified and included in the sample. All right. How can I apply the cluster sampling? One, I want to give you this example. Let's say, for example, and I want to use the institution we are in, all of us now. All right. And I want to use it in a sense that you understand it better. I'm going to focus more in Gauteng. One, our university now, which is UNISA, right? We have two campuses around Gauteng. Please, guys, you must correct me. I'm not talking about the learning centers. I'm talking about campuses, all right? I'll do mistakes there and there, but I'll try as much as possible to eliminate mistakes in my example. But UNISA, for example, in Gauteng province, it has the following campuses. It has the campus which call it the main campus, which they call it is clinic campus. I don't know. I can't pronounce that. It gives me a problem. But the main campus, all right? Then it has another campus down the road, which they call Sunnyside. We also have a campus just around one of the townships, which is based, I think it's Mamelodi, right? Then you have also, I don't know if they call it Mamelodi campus, I don't know. Subject to corrections, guys. I think Masatloni knows better on that. Then we have another campus, which you call it the Florida campus. I'm not sure if there's another campus. I'm familiar with these four in Gauteng. I'm not talking about the learning sites, all right? Just the campuses, all right? Then, if I want to apply cluster sampling, let's say I want to collect data from UNISA Gauteng province. Then I can make sure that I apply a cluster sampling techniques. Then, because I can't go through each and every one of these campuses, then I'll say to myself, based on each campuses, I'll collect a certain number of responses. Let's say 4, right? Then I'll go, let's say I'm talking with the managers there, all right? Then I'll make sure that I sample 4. Then I'll go to another campus, another 4, another campus 4, another campus 4. And what I've done now, I've done what I call a cluster participation, so that I make sure that all the campuses in Gauteng province are represented in my study. Then I've applied a cluster sampling method. I think it makes sense. I'm hoping. Then you can also look at the example I've given there. That's a cluster, right? It's not stratified, but it's according to cluster. That's why I've used the word campuses, right? Then another interesting one is a systematic sampling, whereby a certain number subjects, K stands for certain number subject from the list of the population, is selected. Yes, I prefer to call it an interval sampling. In other words, after a certain number, you sample the equivalent number. For example, I like this example, where I say all employees of the company are listed in alphabetical order. And from the first 10 numbers, you randomly select a starting point. Let's say from the first 10, my starting point is 6. In other words, I've numbered all my participants alphabetically, all right? Let's say from the first alphabet up to the last alphabet and so on, right? Then from there, when I apply systematic sampling, from the first 10th number, I just randomly select a starting point. Let's say I'll start from 6 in this example. What I'll do, I'll select the 6th person, right? Then after onwards, I'll select after the 10th number or the 10th person. Then it means I'll skip the 7th participant, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Then the 10th one, which is the 16th, I'll select that person, right? Then I'll skip again another 9 participant. Then the 10th person, I'll select that 10th person. Then it's going to be number 26. Then I do the same thing. I skip the next 27th person. Then I'll select when I reach the 35, I don't select, but the next one with the 30th person, I select. In other words, I just add 10, 10, 10. All right, that's how it works. You can also generate these systematic sampling techniques using your software. For example, the Word or the Excel. It can also assist you around it. I think it makes sense, colleagues. I want us to work on this exercise for a few minutes. How can you apply a systematic sampling? All right. Remember, we have this is a systematic sample, whereby every a certain number subject from the list of the population is selected. All right, like we've given an example here. So let's see how can you apply systematic sampling technique in this example. I say, if I want to select a sample of 25 learners, I want to select 25, right, learners in my school, and the total enrollment is 100. How will I go apply that systematic sample? And how many I will sample? Does it make sense, colleagues?
Good morning, Doc. I can give it a try. I've put it in the chat box. So I'm not sure. Right. I think I can clearly understand random sampling and stratified, but systematic. So let's say from the sample of 25, if I randomly select number 4, and then thereafter every 5th student is picked, then the sample will be 5 students, which is student numbers 4, the original one that are randomly selected, then 9, then 14, then 19, then 24. So these 5 will be a representative sample for 25 learners.
It's quite interesting, Kofi. Thanks for participating. And yeah, yes, I agree. Because what I've just noted, in fact, you said you started first by taking the total population of enrollment of learners, which is 100. Then you divide it with the predetermined sample size, which is 25. Then it gives you 4, isn't it? It's where you started. Then we always say you need to start somewhere to select. And what they encourage us to do, especially in this simple random sampling, you give numbers to your participant, all right? Remember that, I've just put the solution there. Remember that we have 100 learners. Then you give them numbers 1 up to 100. Then from there, you divide by the sample size you require based on the total number of learner enrollment, which is 100 divided by 25 gives you 4. Then from there, you decide about where do you want to start to sample. They call it starting point. In my case, they always argue that you must always start from the middle number, all right, of the participants. If you have 4, where do you start? You start by selecting from the 3rd participant. But if in your case, like you have indicated, Mr. Godfrey, that you start to select from the fourth, it means from there, every fourth participant will be selected. It's going to be 4, then it goes up like that and that. But if you start with the middle number being 3, it means the first participant you are going to select is participant learner 3. All right. Then from there, you select the next participant after you've counted 4. Then it means you are going to select the 7th participant. Then it goes like that and that, the 11th, the 16th participant, and so on. So that's what you call the systematic random sampling. In other words, after a certain number, you select, all right, according to the way you have set up your system to do that. For example, if I do a work on that, maybe on Excel or Word, I determine a random sample selector. It's going to assist me around that because I'm going to feed the information to say, look, I'm going to start now with number 3. Then from there, select every 4th participant. It's going to generate that on its own. Then it becomes easy for you to come with a selection of your sample. All right. So, all right, I think it does make sense now, but please, the writing up, it also need to end. If you want to put it in the form of a table, you put the actual table, all right, in your writing up, especially in a research report. Then from there, you tell us about the selection, sample selection. Then from there, give the numbers from 1 up to 100. If you don't want to use the actual name of your participant, you can refer to them maybe with pseudomonas name and so on, up to 100. Then from there, you tell us, you show by maybe a circle in that table to say, I've started with number 3, which is able, maybe Abel Kupega. Then I select the 4th one, which is so and so. Then it means I want to have 7 participants whom I've selected. Then from the 11 participants and so on. Just an example, all right? After I've explained this systematic sampling, all right? We want to look at random sampling now. Let's quickly go there, colleagues. Someone once asked to say, when I do my research, can I use more than one technique? You are allowed. Let's say, for example, you decide to say, I'm going to use cluster sampling together maybe with stratified sampling. You are allowed to do that, all right? But my only encouragement, stick to one sampling techniques, all right? So that you don't do mistakes. Because if you start to be all over the place, you are going to do a lot of mistakes, all right? Then let's quickly look at the next one, which we refer to it as, we've done this exercise, colleagues. We need to look at non-probability samples. Please note the difference. Samples which are mostly used under probability sampling are the following: simple random sampling, stratified, and cluster together with the systematic sampling. But for the non-probability sampling, we can use the following: convenience sampling, all right? Where you sample in regards to convenience. In other words, it becomes easy for you to collect this data. Then you say it's convenience, all right? It could be convenience in a different way. It could be maybe about the setup, the location you are, or it could be maybe about the cost you want to incur when you sample this participant. But what is convenience sampling? The researcher says it's a process whereby whoever is available, that's convenience, all right, at a specific time is included in the sample. In other words, you try to include participants who are easily available to you as a researcher, all right, or quantitative researcher, if you want to put it there, or qualitative researcher, all right. You are able to reach them. Simple as that. Take, for example, I always like this example. One, let's say, for example, I'm working in this institution, all right? Then I'm offering a class to my students, all right, where I offer research methodology. Let's say it's face to face, right? Then I want to collect data and research based on something else, but in regards to research methodology. How can I do it? I can apply a convenience sample. I can take the questionnaire and give it to my class list or to my students in class. It's more convenient, all right? Instead of taking the questionnaire and give it to other learners in different faculties or departments. It's not convenient. In other words, I try as much as possible to collect data from people whom I can access easily. And remember that always, when you apply the convenient sampling techniques, you must bear in mind the bias principle. There are times you'll be biased, all right, around that. And you don't want any biasness. I think that's how I can explain it quickly now, all right? That's convenience. One, I can give another example. In the study we were trying to conduct with my colleagues, basically, we developed a new data collection instrument, starting from last year up to somewhere in January this year. Then we call it phase 2. So last year, what we did, we piloted the instrument and we have applied a convenience sample. In other words, we took the questionnaire and we gave it to our lecturers who are teaching within the units few modules. And I remember that we pick up those modules. Then how convenient sample was applied, because we didn't want to give it to other lecturers who are teaching other modules in other faculties. We wanted to be more convenient. It was easy to access this data population of our students, all right, when you do piloting. Then convenient sample was more appropriate around that. Then we have what we call the purposive sample, all right? Participants are selected based on specific characteristics. Please note that when you go to qualitative sampling, this one, it is more also applicable in the qualitative sampling, because you sample your participant according to specific characteristics. We've spoken about this, like experience or knowledge. And also in quantitative, it's also applicable. The example I've given to say you want to collect data from these teachers or this type of a sample and it's not accessible, or you are getting some hardship to do that. Then you decide to be excited and you go to your friend who is a chief executive officer of a certain mine. Then you collect data from those miners. Then it means you are outside your parameters. Definitely, what happens now, you can't call it purposive sampling, because you didn't sample according to the purpose. You didn't look at certain characteristics and experience of your participants. Because those who are in mining and those who are in education are quite different. What does this example say now? Another example, you want to know more about the opinions and experiences of first generation students, not first year students, but the first generation students at your university. So you purposefully select a number of those students. I think here I've tried to correct it. I think yesterday it was not corrected. It's supposed to be purposefully, all right? Now, your participant, they should be first generation students. How do you define first generation students from your case? Which students are we referring to as first generation students? Basically, I think all of you are familiar. Those are the students who are the first people or persons in their communities, all right, or in their households to attend university. We refer to them as first generation students, not first year. Unfortunately, those are not the first years, all right? They are referred to as first generation, right? In other words, those are the students who are the first students, not first year students, but they are first students to attend university from their households or from their village and so on. We refer to them as first generation. It could be a third year student, by the way. All right, a student who's doing the third year, it's still first generation. All right. But now let's assume you want to then, for purposely sampling, you sample for certain purpose. What's the purpose here? You want to get first generation students. So it means your questionnaire should go to them. Then your system will be able to tell you who are the first generation students. I don't know in some of the institutions I know about where I work permanently, we have a first year experience program whereby every year, all right, for the first years, for argument's sake, we take that. Then one of the questions they'll ask, are you the first person in your family or household to attend university? And the study which you collected even last year for students who started this year, the majority of them are first year generation. They are first year generations. All right. In other words, they are the first people to attend university studies from their families. All right. So another one is a quota. I think all of us are familiar with the quota. Eh? Remember when we get our independence in 1994, if I'm not mistaken, one of the sample technique which was also applicable in sports, all right, could be maybe rugby, could be, especially rugby and tennis. The quota system was emphasized by the government to say in your list of your participant in a certain sporting field, a certain number should be people of color, all right? They should be from another race and so on. It's a quota, all right? A quota system. It's a method in which researchers create a sample involving individuals that represent a population, all right? I've just given an example about in regards to quota. Then you have another one, which is snowballing sample. Basically, it's when you don't know the best people to study due to complexity of events. It's a COVID-19 pandemic, sorry. Therefore, you could ask the target participant to suggest other individuals that could be sampled. Colleagues, I've seen this. I think I've mentioned it. I did mention it in one of my presentations, if I'm not mistaken. How other students did apply this type of sampling. Remember that what happens during COVID-19, especially in 2020, all right, when we started to act in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. Most of students, they have their research proposal written and they have ethical clearance. Some of them have started in 2020 even to collect that. But in their research proposal, they indicated that they are going to go to schools and so on and distribute questionnaires to the teachers and so on and so on. Then COVID came in. I remember with one of the students whom I was assisting with her master's degree. We have to debate this. The permission granted through and the ethical clearance which was granted to the study, in the research proposal, she was supposed to collect data face to face. It was quantitative, giving the participant the questionnaire in the different schools. I think she identified, I'm subject to correction, I think there were 2 schools or 3 schools, I can't remember well. But COVID came in. The participant could not collect data. So what we did, she applied, and I applaud that student, honestly. She was more innovative and creative. And she said she's going to apply the snowball polling sample. And remember, the student was already writing the her master's now, the report. And the proposal through and the ethics given was talking about something else in regards to the sample technique. All right? She has to change. And how did she change? You are required, you'll see when you talk about a presentation on ethics, you are required to divert from the ethical clearance given, as long as it's not a major change, all right? Or as long as if the change was inevitable, like COVID. Then the student said, I've decided to apply snowballing because due to COVID, I cannot reach the schools, all right? And in that case, the student did the following. She developed an online questionnaire through, I think, MS Forms, and emailed and sent to the principal of the 3 different schools to distribute to the teachers. Unfortunately, there was a link there, and she was not able to get that. So she decided to say, I'm going to apply the snowballing. Then she went to the 3 principals. She spoke to them online and so on, telephonically and email, and said, look, I'm not getting data from your teachers. Can you guys, as principal, the 3 of you, refer me to another 3 schools? All right, not the one I've mentioned in my research proposal and ethics. All right, other neutral schools. Then she applies snowballing and collect data from this 3 schools, and definitely she was able to get data and analyze the data. So I think my example also talk about something different then, all right? But it's almost similar, all right? It's almost similar. So you need to justify, she had to justify on the research report why now she's using snowballing sample technique, not the one which was included in the research proposal. And everyone will agree about it, all right? Even the supervisor and myself, and yeah. I'm glad the student managed to graduate. I think it was last year, what you say? I think it was last year, if I'm not mistaken. All right. Having said so much, let's look at sample techniques in qualitative research. I want firstly to come, and I want to rush here quickly, sorry. I want to come here first. The sample size in qualitative. All right. These are some of the authors. Adler and Adler, they argue that the sample size in qualitative, it should be between 12 and 60. And remember, it's possible. And I agree with them. If I want to sample 12 participants, maybe I can decide to do a focus group interview. All right? But an average should be 8. So why are we bringing this? I think one of presenter said all of this during a presentation somewhere this year for UNISA students. Then I pick up there because I attended that presentation. Basically, my understanding is that in order to justify your number in qualitative or in quantitative, you must base it on research. Tell us what the researchers are saying. If you say in this qualitative research, I've decided to sample 12 participants because that is what author such as Adler and Adler argue about. All right, so you back your sample size with literature. What does it say? Another author which are also interested here is Bernard. Bernard says you need to sample between 10 and 20. All right, between 10 and 20. It's otherwise, it should not be less than 10. Good, but not more than 20. Interesting. But this author brings something which is very, very important. It brings knowledge. Spoken about that one. In qualitative, knowledge is the key. All right. people who you are sampling, they must be knowledgeable, all right, about the content you are interviewing them on. But this author, Budi, says 12 in case of focus group and 30 in case of individual interview. It's a lot, eh? What can you say? But Creswell, I think I like Creswell, talks about between 20 and 30 informants, which are participants for a grounded theory study, all right? And also 4 to 5 cases per study for case study research, and 2 or 3 for narrative research, all right? In other words, the case study research is where you collect data and all of this and this and this. But the narrative one is where you look at perceptions and all of this and that, all right? But Ritchie and the other authors, they suggest not more than 50 for individual interviews. So bear in mind about these authors. But what's important is that sampling techniques in qualitative research, what's happening there? Researchers in qualitative research select the participant based on the following criteria. 1, I would argue that I've selected my participant based on them of their characteristics. All right, to say definitely they are from the schools and they represent part of the population of the school. Knowledge, they are knowledgeable about the content. If my study is about staff development, all right, and I decide to interview 7 principals, they are knowledgeable about staff development, all right? They are knowledgeable about everything in regards to staff development. That's why I've selected them. Then the experience they bring in, all right? If I go to my biographical information, especially if I'm doing some of the studies, then I argue about experience. Then means I could have a table where it shows the experience of my participant, the skills they are bringing in. But basically, what's interesting is that purposive sampling techniques is mostly used for in qualitative, all right? Since the participants that have been chosen could provide a specific knowledge in regards to the study topic. Okay, let's quickly look at the next point quickly. We've done this one. Then I want us to look at the writing up of the sections on population and sample. How do you write up these sections in your research document? Population. When you write about population, you do the following. Firstly, you describe or define the concept as presented by various authors. Then you indicate the study population, all right? Then the sample and sample techniques. You define the concept also. You describe the sampling, and also you provide the sample size, and you describe the sampling techniques used in the study. I think we've spoken about this one, all right? I want us to look at this activity. Based on your research topic, work on the following. 1, identify the study population for your proposed study. 2, identify a specific sample method and procedure that you will use to select your participant. And hopefully, you can explain the procedure you will then explain the procedure you will be using and the appropriate size of the sample you are using. Firstly, what you do, you identify the topic. If you already have the topic, you indicate that, and also you identify the study population, how many people you are going to collect data from, if it's quantitative and so on, or if it's qualitative. Then from there, you tell us about the sampling method or procedure you'll be using. All right, it's Godfrey again. All right, Godfrey.
Okay, so my research topic is still a bit long, but my supervisor has asked me to shorten it, so I haven't done that yet. But my my field of study is practical theology. And so what I'm researching on is church-driven social entrepreneurship as a solution for youth unemployment in South Africa.
All right, can you just hold on? It's about self-driven.
Okay, let me just put it on the chat. There it is.
Yes.
On the chat.
Thank
So
you.
church-driven social entrepreneurship as a solution for youth unemployment in South Africa. An evaluation of the impact of Friedenskerk Lutheran Church Outreach Foundation in Hillbrow. So in other words, my study is actually a case study of an organization that's using church-driven social entrepreneurship in Hillbrow as a solution for youth unemployment in the inner city.
All right. So can you share us with, you've indicated the population there, but how are you going to conduct the sample and what sample techniques will be using?
So my estimated population sample of the youth that this center has reached out to are about 500. And the sample size using the purposive sampling, because I want to know something very specific about how this organization has impacted them, to change their status from being unemployed to being employed. So because it's also a qualitative study, looking for perception rather than something that's representative of the whole country's unemployed youth. So I think purposive sampling will serve me well to do this. And so I'll look at 30 youths who are involved with this center for interviews. And then in accordance with what Body has advised in terms of focus groups, because I would also like to do a focus group discussion, I will take in 12 for focus group discussion. So in other words, I'll have 42 people in total that I will look at in my sample.
Now it's quite interesting, Mr. Godfrey, though, especially where you justify your sample size. All right, to say you justify it based on certain authors' views and so on. I think it's workable, and I like the focus group, honestly. Sometimes we forget that you can also do focus group. You can also do focus group online, all right? The way we are doing now through Teams or through Google Meets, whatever platform you want to use. But I'm quite interested in that research. I'm hoping that you will make a good progress around that. And thanks for sharing, Mr. Godfrey.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you. Okay. I think we managed to work on some of the details, and we managed also to understand some of the basic concept in regards to population and sampling, and also we managed to understand how do we select the sample size and how to justify it based on literature. And I think we need to go to the next slide now.
Just a quick one, Doc.
Yes.
On purposive sampling, so we're saying that if you have a study that you basically need knowledge on a particular area, then this is probably one of the sampling techniques you can use. So since it's a non-probability, you can't randomly select. So you're not randomly selecting the participants. So what does purposefully selecting a number of these students mean? Does that mean, like I've done, randomly saying, okay, what's a good number I can work with, which I then said 30 for interviews, and then 12 for focus groups. Is that what purposeful selecting means? So there's no scientific criteria to the selection like we see in probability sampling techniques.
All right, basically, just to make it easier, by purposive sampling, we are saying you are sampling your participant because they are bringing certain criteria. right?
Right.
In other words, because they have a certain criteria in your area of research. Let's take this example you just given, or the one you are going to progress in your study, Mr. Kofi. You are going to select this participant because they have a certain knowledge or experience as participant in this study. All right. I just want to go. I want to go here quickly. Let's go here. You are saying this participant you are going to select in this study of yours, they must be able to give some suggestion on how to cap the youth unemployment and focusing on more on a related position like entrepreneurship, and also working or being part of this denomination, all right, or this church. So it's purposely. You selected them purposely, so that they must be based on certain criteria, so that you're able to get your responses or their participant. Could be experience, could be knowledge, could be their understanding. It could also be the skill they will bring. In other words, you make sure that based on this selected participant, you are going to be able to unpack some of these things. All right. For example, their characteristics, their knowledge, and their experience and their skills. You cannot just go out and select because you are interested in youth unemployment. Then you go beyond your parameters. Your parameter is that they should be attending or being part of this church, if I'm not mistaken. So you don't go to other church. That's why around the city of Johannesburg, we've got a lot of church, but the parameter is that you focus on the participant who are attending this particular church. Then it comes to your purposive sampling. All right. It has nothing to do with the number and so on. But remember that purposive sampling, it can also be applicable also in quantitative research. All right. That's why most of the time when you distribute your data, I think I would like to use that example always. When you design the questionnaire and you distribute the questionnaire to a participant, if you're studying, it talks about a certain parameter or characteristics. Let's say, for example, teachers. You cannot take your participant and give it to the mining guys there. They won't be able, in other words, you select them not in purposely way, maybe it could be convenience. All right, but if it's purposive, they must be able to bring some of those criteria. That's why when you justify them, you also have to indicate that I've applied purposively sampling in my sampling technique because the participant they have this type of knowledge or skill or experience in regards to my topic.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. I think I want to quickly go here before we close. Remember this. We have two types of sampling. We have probability samples, all right, where all of them they weight random, please. All right. Simple random, stratified random, cluster random sampling, and so on and so on. So as long as you know, if, for example, I just want to give this example. One, if I read your document, then you say you are studying, it's a qualitative study, then your sampling technique you have used, it is simple random sampling. Then I'll argue with you to say that type of probability sampling, which is simple random sampling, it's used only for quantitative, but your study is qualitative. So you need to go and correct your sampling technique, all right? And remember these things, colleagues, I'm talking about here. When you write some of these documents, especially your research report, please bear in mind that you are reporting on what you have done. Don't rush, especially some of the sections. I've seen some of the students, honestly. They quickly rush and write their research methodology. even though they have not collected data. They have not even developed a sampling techniques. Then a person will say, I'm writing this, then when I've done that, I'll go and correct. It doesn't work like that. We have done that in the research proposal. It's there. It's what you're proposing. And we accept it. Now it's your turn in your research writing or report to tell us what you have done with what you have proposed. Then you're reporting on it. And it works better, colleagues, in some of the sections, especially in some of the chapters, especially chapter 3. In your master's, where you talk about research methodology, or in your PhD, chapter 4 becomes your research methodology. When you report, and I'm telling you, you won't get it wrong, because you are telling us what you have done. You are not telling us about what you intend to do. All right? And it goes back to one of the documents I received, I think it was last year. Already a student wrote the research methodology without going and collect data. It was the research report. Went further and come with the results and findings. Then I said, on what are you basing these results and findings on? Because you have not went out and collect data. That's why I always say, let's take this process step by step. Well, I know in one of the institutions, I won't mention its name, most of the supervisors for their M and D, from M and D, they don't read one chapter. When you submit chapter 1 up to the last chapter. And for me, it's how they work things out. Maybe it works for them, but I found out that that's how most of our students become stressed. All right, it's better to work chapter by chapter, and we finalize that. I don't mind you guys writing a chapter, one chapter, submitting 3 times. It's better, or 4 times. It's better to do that. But yeah, those are the things I want to bring in, colleagues, quickly. But we need to close up now. All right, colleagues, I think I appreciate your attendance. But thanks for attending this session, and I wish all the best to you in regards to your research writing. Those who are doing honors, I'm hoping that you are able to work on the different sections in regards to your portfolio of evidence and so on. Those who are writing their masters, I'm hoping that you're also making progress, and my PhD students, if are available in this attendance today. But thanks for coming, and thanks, Mr. Toli, to make today's session to be seamless. We really appreciate it. Thank you, guys, and bye.